Hello everyone, welcome to this Reconnect webinar. I'm Andrione-Moylan from the Leuven Centre for Global Governance Studies at KU Leuven, and I will be moderating this webinar entitled The Problem of Peer Review in Militant Democracy, with Professor Jan-Werner Müller, Professor of Politics at Princeton University, and Professor Pieter de Wilde, Associate Professor in European Politics at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, and also principal investigator in the Reconnect project, our Horizon 2020 project on reconciling the EU to its citizens through democracy and the rule of law. Professor Müller studied at the Free University in Berlin, University College in London, and St Antony's College at Oxford. From 1996 to 2003, he was fellow at All Souls College in Oxford. From 2003 to 2005, he was fellow in Modern European Thought at the European Studies Centre at St Antony's. Since 2005, he's been teaching at the Politics Department at Princeton University. He is author of a number of successful books on political thought, democracy, and populism, such as Contesting Democracy, published in 2011, and What is Populism, published in 2016. Among his upcoming titles are Democracy Rules and Christian Democracy, a New Intellectual History. It's a great pleasure to have you with us today, Professor Müller. So thank you very much for being here. Participating as discussant is Pieter de Wilde, who studied political science at the University of Amsterdam and holds a PhD in political science from the University of Oslo. He was senior researcher at the WCB Berlin Social Science Center and visiting fellow at the University of Copenhagen, Stockholm University, and the Center for European Studies at Harvard. Since 2016, he is associate professor for European politics at NTNU. Among his recent journal articles are The Quality of Representative Claims, Uncovering a Weakness in the Defense of the Liberal World Order, and Media Logic and Grand Theories of European Integration. Thank you for joining us today. As for the general structure of this webinar, Professor Müller will present for about 15 minutes on the basis of a forthcoming essay on militant democracy. And Pieter de Wilde will then share his reflections with us, and Professor Müller will have the opportunity to reply. As always, during the presentations, you may send your questions to me via the webinar chat box, which you can access from the control panel. After the presentations, I will then bring your questions into the discussion and allow our speakers to respond. It's my pleasure now to give the floor to our distinguished speaker, Professor Jan-Werner Müller, and we very much look forward to your presentation. You have the floor.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to this online seminar. Thanks to everybody for tuning in, especially given that this is surely an extraordinarily obscure title. So if I may, I'll start off by trying to explain a little bit what these two key terms, militant democracy and peer review, exactly are to refer to, and then lay out what I see as a distinct problem, a problem that I think many people in this conversation probably will actually recognize and probably have puzzled over in a number of contexts, and then probe a little bit to what extent the problem can be successfully tackled, or as the case may be, to what extent it can't. So for shorthand, militant democracy, a term coined in the 1930s by the German jurist and political scientist Karl Löwenstein, refers to the notion that sometimes democracies might have to employ prima facie undemocratic or even anti-democratic means to defend themselves against actors who appear to employ the machinery of democracy to subvert or destroy democracy itself. Classic case of this is, of course, in the eyes of many observers, the Weimar Republic, where the Nazis said quite openly that we are using democracy to destroy democracy. So worth underlining perhaps that we're talking about actors who prima facie don't fall under anything covered by the criminal law, who work within the accepted parameters of legality, and yet who somehow appear to pose a problem for democracy, who might threaten its very existence. Many people working in this area have identified a so-called paradox of militant democracy. They've pointed out that sometimes a democracy, in the process of trying to defend itself against the kinds of actors I was just describing, might actually destroy itself, because it might become so repressive, it might engage in such severe rights restrictions that actually the democratic political culture, or maybe the institutions themselves, become so severely damaged that we are looking at a paradoxical situation of basically self-defense through something like suicide. The term rights restrictions is important in this context. If one thinks about what this term means more concretely in terms of concrete legal measures, the most traditional approach is to think about bans of political parties. This, of course, has happened in a number of European countries not too long ago. But it also refers to, let's say, restrictions on the right to assemble, the right to free association, quite apart from party politics, and of course also restrictions on free speech. Now, let me add one footnote, because by this time you might wonder, well, how is all this really so relevant in the context of the European Union? Well, the thought is that the European Union does actually have something in the treaty that may well be called a form of militant democracy, and that is, of course, the famous Article 7, which, when you think about it, comes down to a particular kind of rights restriction. After all, if it were ever successfully applied, it would amount to a member state government losing at least some of its membership rights in the Union because it is not in compliance with Article 2 values of democracy, rule of law, and so on. Note, however, also, and I think this is not so often pointed out, that in a sense, Article 7 should not really be understood as an intervention in a country. It's more a kind of quarantine of a country, or a kind of sort of isolationism by the rest of the EU member states who've come to the conclusion that a particular country is in breach of fundamental values. In theory, it doesn't change anything within the country itself. In theory, a government could persist with what is seen as a pattern of undemocratic conduct forever and simply dispense with its membership rights. But as everybody knows, it couldn't actually be ejected from the Union entirely. So much for militant democracy. Now, what about this other term, peer review? Of course, academics are extremely familiar with peer review as a basic idea. Specialists of the EU in this context might also prima facie think of things like the open method of coordination, even though, as far as I know, there isn't nearly as much talk about this and excitement in more normative circles as there was 10 or 15 years ago. But what I'm after is rather something different. If militant democracy is acceptable at all, there is obviously a question of which actor or which institution should implement it. Who should come to the judgment that a certain set of actors are posing a threat to democracy? Who should decide on the exact implementation of militant measures? Who exactly should monitor militant measures? And so on and so forth. And the classic answer, so to speak, in this area has, of course, been something like a constitutional court, or more broadly speaking, something like an unelected set of actors who, are clearly seen as being nonpartisan, above party politics, independent, and so on and so forth. That's pretty much also the position of the Venice Commission, where it has issued guidelines on how one should think about party bans or militant democracy more broadly. The reason is, of course, pretty straightforward. One, prima facie, you wouldn't want to put the weapons of democratic self-defense in the hands of actors who might abuse them, in particular who might abuse them along the lines of essentially turning them against their regular political competitors. So the concern is simply that if you had political parties decide on militant measures, they might simply start to outlaw their popular competitors in one form or another. And yet, there are actually instances where peer review has been acceptable in the context of militant democracy. And that's, in a sense, the issue I want to examine more closely. I think this has rarely happened, partly because the elements of peer review are not quite so obvious, or they are bound up with more broader legal measures or institutions which are rarely used. So let me give you 3 brief examples of where we actually see peer review, and then try to think a little bit about what might justify the existence of peer review before concluding by pointing out that in virtually all these instances, there is a very significant problem, not necessarily with the idea of peer review itself, but as far as the interaction of peer review with another important legal and political factor is concerned. So, what are instances where peer review actually plays a role? Well, even in the country, which is often presented as sort of the classic instance of militant democracy, the Federal Republic of Germany, where, as most people know, 2 parties were actually banned in the 1950s, basically a successor party to the National Socialists and then also the Communist Party. Even in this country, political parties actually play an important role in militant democracy. For after all, the Constitutional Court cannot by itself start a process of banning a party or, let's say, restricting the rights of particular individuals, which is also a possibility given the basic law. And there is no such thing as an independent political prosecutor who could start this process all by themselves. It's essentially the institutions which are de facto run by political parties, so the government, the upper house, and the parliament, which can get the ball rolling, so to speak. Now, of course, they don't act in a party political capacity, they act as constitutional organs, but the fact remains that it's ultimately elected politicians who have to make the call as to whether a particular party is perhaps a genuine threat to democracy or not. So that's the first, perhaps less obvious instance of peer review. The second instance is one that probably many people in this conversation will be extremely familiar with, namely, again, Article 7. After all, Article 7 builds in a mechanism that forces European member state governments to look at one or possibly 2, if you think about the situation in the European Union right now, member state governments, and decide whether these governments are still sufficiently like them as far as compliance with basic values is concerned, or whether no, they've sort of left a realm of basically shared understandings of these values. I'll talk later about the particular problems this has caused, but prima facie, this is also an instance of peer review as part of militant democracy. And then thirdly, if you permit me, a non-European example, and one that perhaps has a certain relevance this very day, or maybe especially tomorrow, think about impeachment. Impeachment in the context of the US Constitution is of course exercised by elected politicians. It's what was originally known as the People's House, the House of Representatives. Remember that initially the Senate was not directly elected. It was for these elected politicians to judge somebody else, another politician, and decide whether this person was still, in a sense, sufficiently like them in terms of observing the relevant oath, in terms of basically being within the parameters of legitimate political action, or whether that person is abusing the office or in some other sense is guilty of high crimes and misdemeanors. Just as a footnote, right now here in the US, there's a sort of little side discussion about, is impeachment political or not? And some people, of course, especially on the liberal left, say, don't call it political, that delegitimates it, that makes it sound like it's just a kind of party political sort of strategy that, has no real validity. Whereas I think some more sophisticated observers are actually saying, well, on one level it is political and it's meant to be political in a certain sense, and that is not illegitimate at all. It's exactly what was intended. It was exactly intended not to be like a court proceeding. It was meant to involve peers of sorts who will then ask to judge somebody else in terms of the, sometimes very difficult question as to whether that person was still, in a sense, acting within the parameters of legitimate political conduct. So just to point out that perhaps this whole issue is not quite as obscure as one might think initially, and actually the designers of at least some of the institutions I just mentioned obviously thought that at least a certain degree of something like peer review was important to build into the process. So what might possibly justify that? Well, here are two reasons, and maybe others can think of ones that haven't occurred to me yet. So one pretty obvious one, you might say, is something that, if that's not too highfalutin a way of putting it, could be called something like an epistemic advantage. There is something about being a peer that perhaps allows you to see things that people in a different position, including in independent positions of sorts, might not quite be able to see or might not be able to judge as properly. So there is a kind of element of professionalism or judgment on the basis of experience, which, in a sense, if you think about peer review in an academic context, we're all quite familiar with, that might justify the use of this particular mechanism in questions which are bound to contain a strong dose of politics. So that's one reason. A second reason might be that peer review, at least in the instances I mentioned a few minutes ago, builds in a certain level of discretion. It allows the relevant actors to also refrain from militant measures under certain circumstances. It allows them to say, well, if we look at the overall situation, we think, for instance, that a political party, is very problematic, but we don't really think that it constitutes a fundamental threat to our democracy as a whole. We try to resort to other non-militant measures. We try to talk against them, but without restricting their rights. We'll invest in more civic education. We form a cordon sanitaire of all the other parties around this particularly problematic party. All these things, can remain on the table, and yet one can basically also say we'd rather refrain from anything directly militant, perhaps because one worries that a repressive measure will make the members of a party, the leadership of a party, into martyrs of some sort or another, or all kinds of other reasons that could possibly come in. And the same discretion might apply in the context of the European Council. The same discretion might apply in the context of impeachment. Again, if I may add a footnote on the latter, I think this is not generally that well known, that very often actually individual members of Congress have started impeachment proceedings against all kinds of presidents in recent years. Not so much in the 20th century actually, but there was also quite a lot of talk of impeachment talk around Reagan. There was quite a lot of talk about George W. Bush as having to be impeached, Obama as well. And these sorts of initiatives have generally died very early on, partly because others had the discretion to say we just don't want to pick this up. Now this would contrast with situations where there is a clear duty to engage in militant democracy, and where as a result this kind of discretion wouldn't be there. There wouldn't be anything like what the Venice Commission has occasionally called a political filter, and hence you might have a situation where there are far too many restrictions, far too many party bans. An example of this would be Turkey. Turkey, let's say pre-Erdogan, which, you know, as many of you know, was basically banning a lot of parties for all kinds of reasons, in a way that was seen as highly problematic, including by the Venice Commission. So these are at least two arguments one might want to deploy in favor of peer review: discretion and epistemic advantage. But as I said earlier, there are problems, and quite significant problems as well. And I'll finish on that more negative or skeptical note. I think it's important to, on the one hand, be clear-eyed about these problems, and at the same time think about the fact that they perhaps don't necessarily go to the core of peer review as a principle, and these problems don't in and of themselves invalidate all possible applications. They don't necessarily speak against discretion and epistemic advantage as distinct virtues of peer review under certain conditions. But nevertheless, they are real, and they are the following. Basically, those, I think, who designed or included elements of peer review might not have quite seen the problematic interaction between peer review and political parties or political party system dynamics. Let me try to illustrate this point with two of the three examples I brought up earlier on. Think about the European Union. Think about the fact that, as many observers have by now pointed out, Article 7 proceedings always seem to die in council or seem to get stalled in a major way, because we are dealing with member state governments, which are obviously ultimately staffed by party political actors. Now, that's in and of itself not enough to say that, oh, this could never work. But we're dealing with party political actors who are operating in a highly peculiar overall context. Many of you might be familiar with the important work that our colleague Dan Kellerman has done on this question. His conclusion, when he has examined sort of rule of law defenses in the context of the EU, has of course been that a major obstacle is the fact that the European party system, on the one hand, is developed enough to make party loyalty a real factor. So, to put it bluntly, yes, German Christian Democrats care about being loyal to Viktor Orban. Maybe that's going to change, maybe not. But for a long time, it was very clear that that he was their man. They were going to protect him. They were going to make sure that no real measures were going to be taken against him. Nothing that would really hurt or bite, so to speak. So party loyalty mattered enough to ensure this kind of outcome. At the same time, as Dan has pointed out, the party system isn't developed enough to get anything like a real pan-European debate or a real pan-European conflict around some of these issues going. And that's partly because of actual legal obstacles to parties intervening in other member states, finding a voice there, in a sense, pushing some of these rule of law and democracy issues up into a genuinely pan-European conversation. Now, one can wonder whether even if they could do that, there really would be a pan-European conversation about some of these questions. But that's an open empirical matter. The point is that in this particular instance, in the context of the European Council, party politics has been a very negative factor, but it's, I think, not enough to say that that entirely invalidates the idea of peer review. It just shows that under current conditions, it's very difficult to make this work, other than perhaps scenarios where within national contexts, citizens or maybe other parties put significant pressure, let's say, on German Christian Democrats to actually come clean on the fact that one of their members has systematically dismantled the rule of law, has systematically attacked rights which are essential for democracy, has systematically destroyed media pluralism, and so on and so forth. And since I also mentioned this non-European example, allow me to add a few words about the situation in the United States, because I think it's also a very good example how one can see the limits of peer review. Again, not because the principle itself is normatively or even practically so flawed, but because it is interacting with something else that in a certain way hasn't developed enough, or in this case here has gone badly wrong. What I'm talking again about is political parties. It's worth remembering that the people who wrote the US Constitution, of course, didn't want political parties at all. They saw parties as basically always just factions of fanatics, factions of self-interested actors who would conspire against the common good. When you think about their original vision of even how presidential elections were supposed to unfold, they clearly had something like peer review in mind, even in that context, when they basically thought of the Electoral College as a kind of assembly of, reputable gentlemen who would choose the person with, the greatest reputation, with the greatest virtue, and make that person president in a kind of, well, you might as well say peer review process. Of course, parties emerged anyway in the early 19th century that didn't destroy the political system. It didn't destroy it as long as parties essentially were willing to recognize each other as legitimate, as long as they were willing to compromise, as long as they were willing to work in a system of checks and balances and a fairly strong division of powers. As everybody knows, what I just said can no longer be taken for granted in 2019. This process has often been described as polarization. That in one sense isn't entirely accurate, because we're not talking about a symmetrical polarization. It's not like the two parties have moved somehow to the extremes. It's only one party that has significantly radicalized in the last 20 or 30 years or so. And that's, of course, the Republicans, who essentially have taken themselves out of these mechanisms of peer review, who, as you all know, when you look at, if you looked at news just in the last couple of days, are willing to say that they will not really fulfill their constitutional duty in terms of upholding the division of powers, in terms of Congress acting as a real check on the president. The leader of the Senate just announced last week that he will coordinate closely with the White House, basically follow the White House playbook in terms of setting up the Senate trial. So this, again, you might say, going back to what I said a few minutes ago about the European situation, is that an extreme case of party loyalty trumping, well, no pun intended, trumping absolutely everything else. And under those conditions, peer review clearly can no longer work. Allow me to add one last point. If one reasons sort of through these issues, one is perhaps driven back ultimately to a more general problem with the whole idea of militant democracy. It's a problem that is actually not just specific to this notion of peer review, but maybe points to a deeper paradox with militant democracy. It's a paradox that's been identified by our colleague Christoph Möllers from Humboldt University in Berlin, who at one point observed that countries which can have militant democracy probably don't really need it. Why? Because the relevant actors can agree that such potentially quite restrictive, quite repressive measures would be acceptable, because they think they couldn't possibly be employed against them. There will be a sense that, well, everybody sort of is on the same basis as far as fundamental values, as far as the observation of certain norms are concerned. So it's good to sort of have this machinery in place, but ultimately it's probably not really going to be necessary to save democracy. And when one looks back, for instance, on German post-war history, I think many observers would say that, yes, it was probably on the one hand justified to ban the neo-Nazi party in the 50s. With the Communist Party, it's already more debatable, but many people would be on board with that as well. But had they not been banned, would German democracy have gone to hell? Probably not. Whereas in other contexts, where the danger might be real, it probably is not going to be possible to either have this machinery of militant democracy in place, or if you have it in place, you will not really be able to use it, because something like polarization or excessive sense of party loyalty has already become so strong that the machinery essentially becomes useless. So the paradox is that where you can have it, you don't need it, and where you need it, you can't really have it. So that's different from the other worry, the other paradox I pointed to at the very beginning when I said, oh, people worry that, you know, this could be a matter of self-destruction through self-defense. I think this is a more subtle, more interesting, and in a sense more troubling thought, because it makes us potentially think that when the chips are down, even having this kind of insurance policy through the possibility of militant measures, it's not really going to help us. So I'll finish on that skeptical note. I look forward to comments, responses, criticisms, questions, and then a wider conversation. Thank you.
Professor Müller, thank you very, very much for this engaging analysis and your presentation. Peter, you have the floor. You may go ahead with your comments.
Thanks. Thanks for the talk. This is a very stimulating line of thought, and what I particularly like about your argument is taking the Article 7 principle, it's the institution, and also the current debate about whether or not to apply it to the Hungarian and perhaps also Polish governments in a broader context, a broader international context and a broader historical context. And that's very stimulating in terms of food for thought. So the first question that came to my mind while listening to you, and I've also had the pleasure of reading some of your work on this, is why draw on the comparison to the Weimar Republic? Because what I thought was, wouldn't a comparison with another regional organization be more applicable? And I'm thinking about the debate about suspension of Venezuela in the Organization of American States last year. For more or less similar reasons, deterioration of democracy in Venezuela, calls within the Organization of American States to suspend this. And it would be a similar mechanism in the sense of the peer review that you describe, and also in the sense of not really overthrowing the Venezuelan government, but quarantining it, as you call. And that, to me, immediately raises an answer to the question of why peer review in this case, which would be lack of an authoritative alternative. If there is no such an institution that has the authority, that has the widespread recognition of being able to intervene in such a case, like a Supreme Court in a federal state does, which the EU lacks. I mean, yes, there is the Court of Justice, but I can already see many headlines in newspapers. European Court of Justice says we are no longer a democracy, and that would not only go down not so well in the UK. I think that would go down pretty badly in almost any member state. So that's the question. Where do we draw a comparison? Do we go for the national and federal state comparisons, like Weimar Republic, impeachment in the US, or should we look for more suspension within international organizations as the precedent for Article 7, like, for example, the debate about Venezuela and the Organization of American States? The second thing that I thought was really interesting about your argument here is the theorizing about logics at play, pros and cons of peer review, including, for example, the logic of competition. And here I was thinking, so member states in the EU aren't directly each other's competitors, because political parties, even though they're all partisan actors, they wouldn't be able to compete in, say, Hungary or Poland for office. So parties outside of Hungary are not Fidesz's direct competitors, but Article 7 does enable the suspension of voting rights. And in that sense, there might be a competition element here, because if you suspend one member state's voting rights, that increases your own voting power in the council. So there's an incentive there to trigger Article 7. And if you think of the party political reasons, I think there might be even more incentives to do this. Any member state leader who is not a member of the European People's Party, where Fidesz is in, has both an institutional, intergovernmental, and a partisan incentive to argue for triggering Article 7. For someone like Mark Rutte, the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, member of the Liberal Party, I would see a win-win situation of campaigning for triggering Article 7 against Hungary. You can shame the local Christian Democrats. You can argue for presenting yourself as the champion of liberal democracy. And it would be so easy to say, that's a kleptocratic government, we should suspend them, it's a waste of taxpayers' money, they all put it in their own oligarchic pockets, and the EPP is protecting them. A kind of wag the dog strategy. You know, whenever you get into domestic problems, you could flash this card and redirect attention elsewhere. But it doesn't happen. Why not? Is it the case that it simply doesn't draw enough attention, that people aren't alert enough to this, that it wouldn't work if Rutte would try to redirect attention from some local scandal he was involved in by saying, yeah, but you know, Hungary. I think there's a little bit of truth to that might not be the case. But on the other hand, there's enough EU awareness and enough Europeanization of public spheres that this would at least resonate somewhat. And yet it doesn't happen. So I'm wondering whether the problem that you identify with what you call extreme party loyalty might be even more severe and also encompasses extreme intergovernmental loyalty, where member states are so loyal to the governments of other member states that they're not even willing to engage in peer review, even if all the incentives, both the intergovernmental institutional ones and the party political ones, would speak for it. So that's my questions to you.
Great.
Peter, thank you. Yeah, Professor Müller, you may go ahead. I'd just like to remind our audience that they can send us their questions for the Q&A that we will have later on. Go ahead.
Yeah, so thank you. These are excellent, which is to say difficult questions. And I'm glad that I now have 5 hours to respond to them appropriately. On the first one, so you're of course completely right. I mean, especially in the EU context, the Weimar analogy is not exactly the most appropriate one to think about. I only mentioned it to make the intuition behind militant democracy in general somewhat more plausible, even though, maybe as a footnote, even for that purpose, actually, it's much less straightforward than is sometimes thought. Historians can disagree about this, of course, but it's at least debatable whether it's really true that Hitler was brought to power in something that can be called an entirely legal and entirely democratic process. The enabling law was certainly voted on under conditions which could no longer be seen as anything properly democratic, and even what happened before in terms of emergency rule and so on, I think is more complicated than this sometimes too casual tendency to basically say, oh, the people, they want to bring extremists to power, we have to, take away their options, than this kind of story suggests. I agree also that it would be important to have more systematic comparisons with other regional organizations. I think we have some of these comparisons actually. So think of the work of Carlos Closa, for instance, at the EUI, or Cristóbal Rivera Calpasar in Chile. I think they've done a lot of interesting stuff on sort of seeing how these different regional, ultimately also human rights regimes might function or fail to function, depending on some of the factors involved. Let me also, however, clarify that in a sense I'm not advocating peer review as such. I'm not saying this is a great system. We just have to make it work marginally better. In terms of a positive proposal, actually, what I have tried to put forward for a number of years is precisely something that looks much more like an independent authority called Copenhagen Commission, in honor of the Copenhagen criteria, that would consist of basically judges, experts, former politicians, maybe civil society leaders, people who could take an impassioned look at the situation in a member state, and then to some degree might even trigger particular sanctions, especially financial sanctions. This has of course been debated here and there, but at this point I think it's fair to say that politically it's very unlikely that anything like this will be implemented anytime soon. I think that in terms of what you mentioned, as in, oh, if you give it over to a court, or let alone a commission like the one I just mentioned, that's going to be seen as obviously illegitimate. I think the jury is out on that. I think with Article 7, there's the obvious incentive to basically, as a government that is being sanctioned, say, look, it's the Germans who are doing it to us. It's the French. It's sort of specific nations with whom perhaps you have a difficult history that sort of go after us. Of course, we do have a precedent for all this, namely Austria in 2000. And if you look at the ways in which Wolfgang Schüssel in those days mobilized Austrian public opinion, it clearly, I think, his ability to do that in a certain way benefited from the fact that it was not really an independent institution, even though the 14 member states at the time sort of hid behind the Portuguese presidency. But as everybody remembers, it was basically a sort of set of bilateral sanctions decided upon by the 14 other member state governments. And I think it helped Schüssel enormously to say that, look, here is mighty Germany going after us, here is mighty France, they themselves have the Front National at home with which they can't really cope, but now they're going after us in purely symbolic politics and so on. So that's neither here nor there as an empirical prediction of how it might be different with a different kind of authority. But I would say at least the jury is out, and it's an open question what might actually work better or worse on the ground. One thing actually on which the jury is not out, and I think this might be worth emphasizing, is that more recent attempts to really rally public opinion against the European Union, to the extent that we have any empirical data on this at all, have not been terribly successful. So at least the surveys I know about Viktor Orban's so-called war of independence, in line with previous wars of independence against the Ottoman Empire, against the Soviets, and now against Brussels, have not really been popular. And some of you probably know these surveys, which also show that actually the EU remains highly popular in Hungary and Poland. I'm only mentioning that because ever so often we hear the argument that, oh, if the EU were to do more, you would turn these countries into, you know, a people of Eurosceptics, and, you know, more countries would leave the EU, and so on and so forth. At least on the basis of this data, that seems kind of an implausible scenario and an implausible threat. On the second point, I think it's an excellent question. Why doesn't, again, if you look at it abstractly, why doesn't happen this more? Why doesn't this happen all the time? Given that some of the relevant actors would seem to have all the incentives to, you know, basically play these sorts of games, maybe for good reasons, or perhaps more worryingly, sometimes for very bad reasons. So I could think of a number of factors which point us to an answer. The first one, very broadly speaking, and this will not surprise anybody as a claim, is simply that at the end of the day, the European Union runs on the basis of a culture of consensus finding, compromise, not shaming others publicly, when it occasionally happens, even in much less dramatic circumstances. This is seen as a kind of breach of informal norms, and one might like or not like this kind of culture, but I think de facto it's what makes a lot of the show kind of go on and run properly. And in a sense, ostracizing one member state government is a pretty radical departure from this. So that's one factor. Another factor is that, of course, not all member states, shocking news, have equal amounts of power or influence. And I think there have been instances where it's pretty plausible to think that some member state governments actually would have been interested in going down the path that you, Peter, sort of talked about, in terms of, look, let's, for instance, prove that, let's say François Hollande is still a good defender of French Republican values, because he publicly speaks out against the destruction of democracy in Hungary. Wouldn't have cost him anything at home politically. Probably also wouldn't have benefited him very much, because as far as I know, there wasn't much discussion of Hungary in the media in France, and actually also parts of Southern Europe, until just a few years ago, basically. So also wouldn't have been terribly advantageous, but no obvious political cost. Except at that time, I think Angela Merkel would have been very upset that at the height of the Euro crisis, somebody opens up, you know, yet another front of political conflict, and all of a sudden it just doesn't look just like, okay, we are telling countries what their budget has to look like. We're also now telling them what their democracy has to look like. Of course, that's not really what Article 7 is about, but I think that would have been the sort of the fear of a certain kind of pushback. And again, it might be worth remembering that the one precedent we have of all this, which I think has often been misinterpreted, namely Austria 2000, happened at a time when the EU didn't seem to have a lot of big worries otherwise. And there may have been a sort of margin of maneuver for member state governments, which simply wasn't there anymore in the last 10 years, given that there were so many other things to worry about, so many other crises, such that there was always somebody in the room who would say, oh, but if we now also, you know, actually care about fundamental values, it's just too much, you know, we already have all these legitimacy questions on the table. Personally, I think that's getting the logic exactly the wrong way around. These threats to Article 2 values are a much more profound danger for the EU than even the Euro crisis. Yes, of course, if the Euro were to implode, it would have catastrophic consequences in all kinds of ways. I'm not denying that, but ultimately it would just be a failed policy, and policies fail all the time. But if your promise is that you are going to integrate in such a way that, you know, Polish and Hungarian courts are also EU courts, we can trust each other, we can trust each other's institutions. If that isn't given anymore, if this doesn't work anymore, then it really goes to the heart of the project and kind of really destroys it from within in a way that failed policies generally don't destroy our policies necessarily. Last point, last factor I can think of, and again, this will probably not surprise you in the least. I think some actors might shy away from what otherwise might be an incentive to take out the competition because they worry about what our colleagues in rational choice studies would simply call tit for tat. That basically we would get something going where, yes, you know, Orban is ostracized, but then of course Malta is going to be next. And for many years, I think there was actually quite an explicit debate as around 2012 where people said, oh, you know, we were criticizing Orban, but how come the Social Democrats aren't criticizing Victor Ponta at the same time? So again, one can debate to what extent this would really empirically happen in such an extreme way. But I think de facto, that's also one worry that people are going to have at the back of their mind. And again, if you put that together with the sort of general perception of still ongoing crisis in the EU, I think that it could make some of the actors worry that, look, this is going to look to citizens like the whole thing is falling apart. You know, it's disintegration now because, you know, we have country going up against country, and that's, I think, alas, another reason why this kind of peer review, even when it would be appropriate, when it should be applied, might not work in the way that it should actually work. So I'll finish with that as a response.
Excellent. Thank you both for this interesting discussion. Peter, is there anything you would like to add on these points raised by Professor Müller?
No, I suggest we open up, and I might come back later if there's still time.
Very good, very good. So we are indeed coming to the end of this webinar. We did receive a couple of questions, especially on the Austrian case, of course, that already has been touched upon. And Gregor Fischer was specifically asking whether Article 7 itself hinders these kinds of peer review processes, as the one that we saw, for example, in Austria in 1999 and 2000. And then we had from Franke Faisal kind of a broader question about the term itself, militant democracy, and how the associations may not necessarily be positive in the context of the EU, for example, and then why not use a term such as militant constitutionalism, which could be more useful and more suitable in describing the EU's defense of constitutionalism and democracy and so on. And perhaps this, in a way, connects up to generally kind of a broader question on how we deal with populist parties, and it does seem, and it does have, let's say, the quality of an elite-driven process, at least, or at least it can be portrayed as such. And so I was also wondering, even if it's not really part of the logic of militant democracy and peer review, how could one, and whether one could develop a participatory dimension to these kinds of mechanisms, so as to kind of do away with potential criticism of, you know, top-down processes that typically have kind of entrenched this feeling of lack of democracy within supranational organizations, international organizations, and so on and so forth. So perhaps you could elaborate a little bit on that, and then if there are no other questions, we'll bring it to a close.
Okay. Yeah. Let me try to say something about all three questions. So on Austria, I think it's important to get this history straight, partly because my impression, at least, is that this was a kind of traumatic event for many people in the EU, that it's always invoked as a kind of knockdown argument or as an analogy that could immediately close any discussion, because everybody agrees that it was such a failure, it was such a disaster, should never happen again. First of all, it's important to see the pretty obvious differences with situations we have today. At the time that these sanctions were imposed, nothing in a sense had happened yet. So there was no track record. You couldn't point to particular violations of fundamental values. You couldn't point to a restructuring of the judiciary. You couldn't point to a destruction of media pluralism or anything of that sort. In a sense, it was purely prophylactic. Now, that doesn't make it illegitimate as such. I mean, you could, of course, also turn the argument around and say, well, look, the fact that then also nothing happened later on is just actually goes to show that the sanctions actually worked very well as a deterrent. But irrespective of that, this is obviously different from situations in Hungary and Poland today, where there's a long track record of attacks on independent judiciary. And, well, I won't go through the whole list, but you can hopefully see why these are not analogous situations in any shape. Secondly, I think one valid complaint by the Austrian government in those days was that at that time there was already a kind of legal machinery in place that the EU had. And they said, look, if you're so worried about what's going on here, why don't you use that? Why do you do that funny thing with bilateral sanctions, which in some cases also look pretty ridiculous? Why don't you actually, if you think this is so serious, why don't you actually use what you could use and that we all agreed on in the EU should be used in those circumstances? So again, that argument wouldn't work today, because there are plenty of European actors who want to use Article 7, who are not doing anything like, more or less problematic bilateral sanctions. So in that sense, I think one should be very careful with simply invoking this as sort of an obvious reason why this could never really work. On the term militant democracy itself, I don't think it's such a bad idea to keep democracy in there. Why? Because those who might be tempted to call it militant constitutionalism or militant liberalism, God forbid, I think then are in a position where they make the fact that some of the governments in question are not just hurting constitutionalism or liberalism, but democracy itself. They sort of make that disappear from the conversation. And I think that's also a reason why we should not use the term illiberal democracy as an analytic concept to understand some of these regimes. My point is not that, they're not popular or they couldn't possibly get a majority even in a free and fair election. We're not talking about the empirical question whether they have some democratic backing or not. We're talking about the fact that these governments don't just attack independent judiciaries, they also attack rights which are constitutive for democracy as such. So most obviously, free assembly, free speech, free media, and so on. So if you say illiberal democracy, or if you say, militant constitutionalism, I think you basically cede democracy to them. You basically say, yeah, you guys are Democrats, we accept that. We just think you're illiberal or you violate constitutionalism and so on. And I think that's conceptually problematic, but it's also very problematic on a kind of strategic level, where rhetoric matters a great deal. So I think it's fateful if we end up in a situation where basically the Orbáns and the Kaczynskis get to keep democracy on the national level, and then the kind of European repair crew led by in the old days Franz Timmermans comes along and says, we're here to repair the rule of law, we're the liberals, or we're the constitutionalists, we help you, you get your liberal kind of part of liberal democracy back in order. I think they'll be entirely justified and in fact should say, no, we also care about democracy, and we care about the fact that you've damaged democracy in very significant ways. That also leads, I think, to the last point. Does all this have to look like a elite-driven or, God forbid, technocratic sort of top-down process? Well, it doesn't have to. I think nothing prevents civil society organizations, citizens, to take their own initiative and basically put pressure on some of these governments from below, so to speak, at the same time. These are not mutually exclusive strategies. But especially in situations where life has already been made very difficult for civil society, we should, I think, also not be starry-eyed about the limited room for maneuver that some of these actors might have. Would I love to see more transnational mobilization around these issues? Yes, but it's very difficult given that our European public sphere, isn't exactly super well developed for everybody to kind of have all these issues on the radar screen. And to do this in a very sustained manner, I think is also very difficult, given that lots of people also have other worries in their life. So I think it'd be wrong to think about this as either or, but it's also important to say that yes, under certain circumstances, ideally civil society, so-called ordinary citizens, should be much more involved. And very last point, I think this is also an important argument to push back against, again, all the usual rhetoric like, oh, if the EU pushes too much, you're going to alienate ordinary Hungarians and ordinary Poles. They're going to be Eurosceptic, there's going to be such a nationalist backlash and so on. Maybe, maybe not. But remember that there were also plenty of Hungarians and Poles who in 2014, when their countries joined the European Union, felt that, okay, now we're safe in terms of there can't be any return to anything authoritarian. And of course, the EU itself very much played on this promise and said, join this club. This is not just an economic club. This is not just about a common market. This is about common values. This is about a common understanding of democracy, human rights, rule of law, and so on. And if the EU does nothing, it's not neutral. You are letting down all those people who in 2004 thought that a certain promise had been made. And if the EU doesn't get its act together, it is basically breaking that promise. It is us who are breaking that promise. So in that sense, I think there's another link to citizens themselves, which I think has to be emphasized. And I'll finish on that rallying cry, if I may.
Great, wonderful. Thank you so much. Peter, final intervention?
Well, I think this is very, very stimulating, and I think the last point about obligations to citizens, and we should not look just only at these governments, is a very important point. Maybe one final question that struck me is, when do we know militant democracy succeeds in defending its system? The EU is a system of muddling through. That's what it's built to do. It's what it's best at. And so far, it's been muddling through. Can we say that the EU is dealing successfully with democracy and rule of law challenges in Central and Eastern Europe by surviving?
Well, I think survival, I would say, is too minimal a criterion, because you can, so to speak, have a facade still standing, and yet the edifice has really been gutted, or what you thought was the substance of the whole enterprise has been damaged, or maybe been completely destroyed. What I would worry about in this context is a situation where there's no official disintegration, nobody leaves, nothing that looks like this is all falling apart, and yet a sort of de facto understanding that we have a kind of core Europe that kind of does work according to the right standards, and then a kind of periphery where everybody knows that things aren't quite okay, and they're kind of at a certain point also are purposefully kept out of the core. But at the same time, nobody really feels like they can do anything. They can do anything about this. And if you sort of add this to the, it's a whole different discussion, but if you add this to the whole debate about multi-speed Europe and to what extent can an entity like this really function with too many variable geometries at the level of policy and actually delivering substantively on some of what it promises, I think you can have an outcome where nobody can easily tell that it's not really working, but at the same time, plenty of actors will be justified to say, well, if you look really closely, maybe actually with a certain degree of peer review, so those who kind of are in the game and know how the game should really be working, and they might say, well, actually, it's not really working, but it's not quite so dramatically obvious to most observers or even to most citizens.
Okay, thank you both very much. This is all the time we have for today. I would like to thank our speakers, Professor Jan-Werner Müller and Professor Pieter de Wilde, as well as our audience members, of course, for taking part in this webinar. Our Reconnect webinar series will continue in 2020, and we will soon release the agenda of our upcoming events, so please stay tuned. For updates on the Reconnect projects and for further information, please visit our website at reconnect-europe.eu. Thank you for joining us, and we hope you will join us again next time. From Jan-Werner Müller, Pieter de Wilde, and myself, thank you and goodbye.